In this unit, we will learn how to use the blending modes, textures, and effects in Adobe Illustrator. Blending modes refer to the variety of ways in which we can blend the colors of some objects with other objects just underneath them. So let's have a look at how exactly that works. In order to access the blending modes, you have to go to the Window panel, select from the drop-down the Transparency. I created two objects here, different colors, that will allow me to see how the blending options are working by blending the colors of these two objects. What I need to do first is overlay one of the curls on top of the other. I'm gonna right click to arrange and bring to front this pinkish one, which is gonna be the one that I'm gonna play with. On the transparency panel here, you see that you have the blending mode, which is set currently on normal. If I'm gonna go ahead and click on that, I have a drop-down menu with multiple options of how the colors of one object will interact and blend with the colors of the other. So go ahead and play a bit around, click through them so you can see how each of them changes the colors of the objects on their common area or even of the object itself with the background. What you can also do is change the opacity and further edit the way that the colors of the objects interact one with the other. And it's not only interacting the colors of two objects together, it can be even more objects. So I'm gonna clone this cow here, and you see how the colors of this one interact with both the colors of the other two. You can play with the blending modes of each of the objects separately. For example, this cow is using the hard light option, while this one the multiply. You can see the two blending modes, how they interact with this blue object that is set on normal with the different blending modes. I'm sure that you still have the question, why should I do that? Why would I do that? Firstly, visually it can be quite engaging and interesting the way that they blend together, but there are also more ways that you can use the transparency. So let's go ahead and switch artboard and move to this illustration here that I created. It's been created using the brush tool and the pen tool. What you see is that I actually locked everything else except from the main shape of the cow. I'm gonna work on that shape to add an effect. In order to add an effect, you go to the Effect panel. You see here that you have the Photoshop effects, which allow you to bring in a bit of texture or different treatments to your graphic. One of my favorite ones is under the texture option, and it's the grain. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on that, and you see that it popped me up this panel, which allows me to preview my graphic, use some extra effects in the middle, and adjust the specific effect on the right hand side. Firstly, I'm gonna zoom out by using the minus button here in order to be able to see the full shape. The second thing that I'm gonna do is navigate through these options here, which are different effects and allow you to have different kind of results on your illustration. Feel free to navigate around them and select perhaps and create a little list of the ones that you prefer the most, so you can always have them ready and easily to access whenever it comes to a commissioned work. One of my favorite is the grain, which does give a bit of texture but is not overdoing it or anything like that. Be careful when you're using them to use them in a very subtle way, because most of them are recognizable and overused and they might feel quite cheap, because designers can actually recognize that you didn't put any of the effort to create this texture here, but it's just a preset that exists. On the right hand side here, as I mentioned, you can actually further adjust the effect that you selected. From here, for example, you can select the grain type. It really depends on the specific occasion what you want to actually achieve. In this occasion, I'm gonna just stick with the stiplet. And you can also play with the intensity and the contrast. On each of the effects, you will have slightly different handles and options here to adjust and play with, depending on the effect itself. Once you're happy, you just press OK and the effect will be applied to your illustration. And this is quite interesting, but I feel like it's a bit too flat. it's like a broken TV or something, because the texture is laying out equality all of the area there. So what I'm gonna do is add a bit of a gradient. Since it doesn't really matter what color we are using, we only need a gradient in order to create a bit of variation on this texture. I'm gonna press the G letter so I can have perfect control on my gradient. You can further adjust now this effect that you added in order to perhaps extend it more on the ears or something like that. So if I'm gonna select my shape and go to Effect and Texture and Grain, this is gonna ask me if I actually want to apply a new effect, which is not what I want, because I just want to further edit the existing one that I created. In order to further edit it, you go to Window and then Appearance. The Appearance panel here is allowing you to see the effects that already been placed to your object. We don't have any stroke here, and you can see on the fill that we have a gradient, and we do have also the grain effect. What I want to change is this grain effect. I'm just gonna click on the grain letters, zoom out again so I can see the whole cow, and further adjust my grain from this panel here. You see how the gradient's been applied. Now, what I wanted to do is to have it a bit more subtle, so I don't want it to be as sharp as it's at the moment. So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this object, so edit, copy, and paste in place. And I'm gonna hide the grain and the gradient as well. I'm gonna switch it to solid color again, so something a bit more pinkish. Send it to back, so right click, arrange, and send to back. I know that behind this grain I have another shape with a color. I can go ahead and access my transparency panel and use the blending modes that we just learned. You see that my grain starts being like see-through. You can play around with a few of the options in order to find which one works the best in each occasion. I quite like this one, the soft light. It's quite subtle and there is a kind of a texture here. I think the soft light was quite nice, and I'm gonna go ahead and reduce a bit the opacity as well. It has a tiny bit of texture as you see, but nothing that is like recognizable. You don't see this ready effect on your panel, so it feels like the designer did put some effort to create it and also did notice all the details, so made it a bit unequal, not like a solid color background in order to apply the effect, but a gradient, so we have lighter and darker parts and so on. So I would suggest you spend some time to navigate through the different effects that are available here. Try to use them in different ways, perhaps adding a gradient or playing with the blending modes and how you can actually make them yours, so personalize them in a way. Another thing that you can do is create your own texture, your own kind of effect. I created this marbling here, which I used inks and water in order to create it. I took a picture of it and I brought it in Adobe Illustrator just by dragging and dropping the image. And what I'm gonna do is use this image to apply it as a texture in my cow. You already know the tools for that, it's just using the clipping masks that we learned. So right click, arrange, send to back to send it behind the shape of the cow. Select both Command 7 or Control 7 on Windows in order to apply the texture. With my white arrow, which is the A letter, the shortcut, I can move it around and reposition it and scale it up or down till I'm quite happy with how it looks. And you see that an interesting texture can lift your illustration even more, especially when it comes to a really simple illustration like this cow's head. I'm gonna go ahead and copy this shape and come to the next canvas here and paste it. I'm gonna perfectly place it again on top of the cow's head. And I'm gonna use this time the blending modes that we learned in order to see how it can actually nicely interact with the colors behind, to make it feel a bit more consistent with what we already have, and not just like a collage part as it was looking like before. Something like this is quite engaging, quite nice. It's still on the color palette of the cow, but it gives a bit of texture, so I'm gonna go and reduce also the opacity a bit. That's a bit too much. That feels a bit more consistent compared to the previous outcome, but it really depends on what you want to achieve. A bit more collage approach or a bit more consistent texture-y approach to your cow. I do create usually different textures by hand that I can use on different projects, or even taking pictures of stuff that I like in the road or when I'm on holidays, or it doesn't really matter where. Just, textures that you feel like they could be nicely used later on in your illustrations. So create a little library folder with different textures that you can have handy whenever it comes to an illustration to actually apply them. You can even create digital textures such as like patterns that we showed earlier in the course that you can use as textures for your graphics later on. The last thing that I wanted to talk to you about are the halftones. And the halftones are these little dots that they can be used in order to fill the area of an object. First thing is to create a gradient. I'm gonna go and access the halftones through the effect panels and then pixelate color halftone. You can adjust here the radius of the dots, how big is gonna be the biggest dot, and put on all of the channels the number 128. I'm gonna explain why a bit later in the course. Press OK, and you see how the halftone is being applied. So you have all these little dots creating an interesting texture within your cow. Again, if you want to further adjust it, you have to go through your appearance panel, which I would recommend to stick it also on the sidebar here so you can have it easy to access. And I'm just gonna click on the color halftone to further adjust it. I'm gonna reduce the maximum radius and see how it looks like with around 30. So you see that the biggest dots are smaller than they were before. And that feels, I think, a bit more interesting. I can still select my shape, press the G letter to access the gradient, and move the gradient around to adjust how the halftone is going to be applied. But you see, unfortunately, you're losing the original halftone settings, so you have to click on the halftone and reapply them. What I mentioned before is to put in all of the channels here the number 128. So let's go ahead and switch to some kind of random numbers to see what is going to happen. I'm gonna zoom in to see. We have the different colored dots that they're represented from the different channels, and once you put the number 128, all of the channels, all of the dots are gonna come one on top of the other, and they're gonna create black dots. So what I would suggest you is to put the number 128 on your halftone on the channels so you can actually use the black and white halftone. The color halftone can be used, but again it feels like a ready effect that you don't have too much control about. So I would suggest sticking with the black and white. It feels a bit more professional and interesting. Now what you can do again is use the transparency panel in order to access the blending modes and see how this halftone can actually interact with your background. And that feels quite nice. It feels quite natural and nicely combined with the rest of the colors of the composition. So I'm gonna stick with that one. Now what you will notice is that if you click on your shape, you actually have no control over the dots themselves. And that is because the halftones are actually rasterized images. They are pixel-based images. What I need to do in order to turn them to vectors is go to Object and then Expand Appearance, in order to expand it, and then again object and image trace, make and expand. Press OK on that panel and you will see how the halftone has been turned to a vector image. You can see while I have it selected that I can see every dot being selected. Because of the blending mode, we got also this cream background, which with my magic wand tool I can click on, delete it with the backspace and get rid of that. And now I have all of the dots of the halftone, which I can go ahead and remove some of them perhaps, or recolor them and further adjust them if I want to. All those effects, textures, and blending modes allow you to push your work even farther, giving them a personal touch as well as a unique look and feel. In the next unit, I'm gonna show you how to convert your raster image into vectors.